Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Trek Politics. I am Mary Trump here with my friend and co host, Bob Cesca. Hey, Bob, how's it going?
Excited to talk about A Private Little War.
Yes, this is, well, we'll get into the nuts and bolts of how we feel about this episode, etc. But before we do that, if you could just let people know what the episode is about in general, get them for
Yeah.
those who have not yet seen it, or pause and go see it because there will be spoilers.
Spoilers in case you missed it sometime in the last 60 years. This is season 2, episode 16, teleplay by Gene Roddenberry, story by Judd Crucis. And I have an observation about that later in the show. It was directed by Mark Daniels. And in this episode, Mary, Kirk, Spock, and Bones explore a Class M planet called Neural, which actually isn't mentioned in the episode, but which is in the screenplay, only to discover that the Klingons are supplying advanced weaponry to a Stone Age society at war with another Stone Age society. It's a direct parallel to the Vietnam War, which in 1968, when this aired, was in the midst of its deadliest year of fighting. Oh, and there's a shrieking monster called a Mugato and a woman with mystical powers tossed into the action. And as always, as you mentioned, spoilers ahead, Mary. We're going to be getting into this in depth today.
Okay, so Private Little War, Season 2, Episode 16 of Star Trek, the original series. Let's dive in.
Incoming transmission.
Trek Politics with Mary L. Trump and Bob Cesca.
So, Bob, you mentioned that this is an allegory for America's involvement in Vietnam, which was at its worst in 1968, and another instance in which Gene Roddenberry shows his willingness to confront head on some of the most polarizing and important issues of his day. And that is something I do like about this episode. It does not pull its punches.
Yeah, and my gripe with this episode is it kind of both sides is Vietnam, with Bones representing the anti-war views at the time, and Kirk represents eventually the interventionist posture of the United States with regard to Vietnam. And that never really ultimately gets resolved because we end the episode just jumping right to the end, where it comes down to whether Kirk is going to order up some muskets for the Hill people to balance the power on this planet, but then kind of sort of changes his mind. How did you interpret the end, Mary, where he goes to tell Scotty, okay, we need a bunch of muskets for the Hill people, but then he stops himself and says, how about some serpents for the Garden of Eden? Did that mean that he was still wanting to intervene by providing arms to the Hill people, or was that him backing off? It's really murky there at the end. How did you interpret that?
I interpreted it as his going through with it, but having enough self-awareness to realize that it was a it was potentially the worst of two terrible options.
Yeah.
But which is essentially a cop out.
Mm-hmm.
Because the other option, while terrible, is it worse than one? Once again, ignoring the prime directive or directly defying the prime directive. And what do you do when another outside entity has already interfered? So yes, it's a terrible situation to be in. But again, clearly Kirk knows that it's going to escalate the conflict. More people are going to die. I guess the only difference is more people will die on the other side as well. So
Yeah, right.
yeah.
Right. I think if this had aired now, I would probably be posting on social media about how Gene Roddenberry chickened out in the end by
Mhm.
not really taking a firm position on the war. Okay, well, there's this, and then there's also the interventionism, but I don't know, maybe it seems like ultimately, though, Mary, that Roddenberry creates kind of a false choice with this episode.
Mhm.
The solution that should have been presented, at least at some point in the course of this story, should have been to chase the Klingons away from the system and to disarm the villagers, right?
Mhm.
That balanced the power without completely steamrolling the Prime Directive and creating, what could have been and what might have been an endless war scenario. Or, on the other hand, a situation where the villagers were completely overpowering the hill people by having access to those muskets, with Klingons continuing to advance those muskets for them in terms of the technology, and maybe even landing on just straight up giving the villagers disruptors to just ultimately annihilate the hill people. So it's one of those things where Roddenberry had the opportunity to take a firm stand on the Vietnam War,
Mhm.
and instead, he just kind of presented, well, here's your Vietnam metaphor, but I don't know. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say,
Mhm,
and I think if we're being generous, which I'm not inclined to be because I agree with you,
mhm.
is that Roddenberry was merely depicting the reality
Yeah,
of what we were living through back then, or what this country and Vietnam was living through back
yeah.
then. That is essentially what happened, and I think the problem I have is that it does suggest that the interventionists were well-meaning people,
Mhm.
and that's one way in which it's not a direct comparison because at least the American government was pretending that this was a engaging in the Vietnam War,
Mhm.
supporting would become South Vietnam, was beneficial to the American people because were fighting for they were protecting democracy and or trying to save the world from communism,
Right.
right? I think that was the argument.
Mhm.
In this episode, it's hard for me to see what the argument is. Like, how is this of benefit to anybody to escalate a conflict in which the two sides who are intervening don't seem to have any skin in the game, if you will.
Mhm.
So that I don't know. It didn't I in that sense it doesn't really work.
Yeah,
Um
and
yeah.
again, I would have been okay with that kind of open-ended conclusion to the story if that other option, a third option, had ever been presented. I mean, the Enterprise and its crew, certainly Captain Kirk, were no strangers to chasing away Klingons. And we can get Scotty to beam out all of the weaponry that the Klingons have provided, and there it is. Maybe this is another instance, Mary, where I'm sitting too close to the TV and overthinking things.
I was not going to say a word. Sorry.
Yeah, I will readily admit that I'm overthinking it, but I think from a storytelling point of view, this was kind of uh, an elephant in the room. It was kind of conspicuous in its absence from the various options. It's either one or the other. And if we had that opportunity, I think in the context of Vietnam, if LBJ could have just summarily disarmed the Viet Cong and prevented the Soviets from providing any more weapons without firing a shot, without bombing a single village or losing a single American life, I think LBJ would have chosen that option. But of course, we're talking about a matter of scale here, where
Right.
you've got a dozen hill people versus a dozen villagers, and that pales in comparison to thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of soldiers fighting in Vietnam. So
Right.
that's one of the things that I wish, if that had been presented, I would have a much greater opinion of this particular episode and its allegory. But
Yeah.
there's one question I wanted to ask you about the character of Nona,
Mhm.
because it seems like Kirk is about halfway through. He's making a pretty strong case for non-intervention based on the Prime Directive. But then you've got Roddenberry writing this Nona character, who I sometimes refer to as the Lady Macbeth of this story,
Yeah.
kind of shames both Kirk and his hill person friend Tyree into changing their minds, kind of wags her finger at them and is coaxing them into the idea of intervening. Is that a what you kind of took away from this character as far as her participation and whether to intervene or not?
Yeah, and first I just want to get back to your other point really quickly about a third option, because I mean, Jesus Christ, they didn't even try to deploy triples.
That's right. There's always the triple option.
Always.
Now that, yeah, I think point well taken, Mary. That's a fourth option.
But anyway, yeah, but back to Nona. Yeah, I mean, she seemed to be like the Henry Kissinger
Yeah.
of the bunch. I mean, just clearly had her own agenda. Um, and I don't know precisely what her motives were.
Mhm.
Obviously, of course, her people are being attacked and killed, and yes, there's that. But there is something Machiavellian about her too, and it
Yeah.
doesn't seem as straightforward as she just wants help. So the good guys could prevail. There's something about her own need for power and
Mhm.
control and manipulation. So yeah,
Mhm.
I agree. This is not a character I was the slightest bit endeared to.
Did you see any red flags with her as far as maybe some sexism goes? Because she is a very sexualized character in this episode and kind of uses that to manipulate the men in the episode. Was that a thing that you noticed in this? I mean,
Yep.
other than the obvious sexism of Nona being raped and killed later on by the
Yes.
villagers. Yeah.
Yes, that was clearly more obvious, but it's another one of those unfortunate Star Trek tropes. Some sexy woman uses her feminine wiles to manipulate a man and get her way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, kind of tired of that.
Mhm.
So, I mean, that's from the cage. Like that's from the very first Star Trek episode. We've been seeing that time and time again.
Yeah.
So that did not help raise my opinion of the episode for sure.
And just that rape scene, I think, is one of the most shocking things in any episode of Star Trek. It
Yeah.
wasn't something that I necessarily remember being 7 years old and watching and going, "Oh wow, they're raping that woman."
Hmm.
But as an adult, rewatching it years later, it was really upsetting to see that because it is straight up the villagers just raping one of the main characters and then
Yep.
stabbing her to death. Is that something that you were at all upset by, seeing that in the midst of this Star Trek episode, there's this very graphic rape scene?
Yeah, of course. It's not something we really expect from Star Trek.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting too, in one of the synopses I read, just because I'm always curious how these things get explained or described, uh, i- the rape wasn't mentioned, just that she
Mhm.
was murdered by a mob on the other side of the conflict. And
Interesting.
so that in and of itself, obviously the rape, the gang rape and the murder uh, were horrifying. But it also feels like it was sort of a cheap narrative trick to make the case stronger for what was truly a terrible decision. Uh, because, well, how could we not? Like, look at what these people have done. And we know that horrific crimes against humanity in Vietnam and probably every other major conflict are committed by both sides. So just as Americans did hideous things in during Vietnam, so too did the Viet Cong, etc. So um, I felt that it was putting a thumb on the scales in favor of what seemed to be Roddenberry's or slash Kirk's preferred outcome here.
I think you nailed it when you said that this is a brutal feature of war, that especially in the Vietnam War, I mean, we've heard in the years since that there were instances like this, these crimes, these atrocities taking place apart from the fighting itself, where civilians were routinely victimized.
Yep.
And so that's a bit of realism. I'm not necessarily complaining about its existence in this story, but going back and having rewatched it at least a few times in the last several years, it's one of those things that's just jumps off the screen as being, wow, there's a straight up rape in the middle of a Star Trek episode. And it's not the first time. We talked about this in the context of Day of the Dove, where Chekhov tries to rape a Klingon woman in one of the corridors of the Enterprise, and Kirk absolutely lets him have it. So this is something that that is unflinching about Star Trek.
So, Bob, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about something that seems to crop up way too often: the Prime Directive, and whether or not Starfleet officers are going to respect it or ignore it, which seems to happen with the latter seems to happen with alarming frequency. So what is going on, especially in this episode? Like, why even bother having a Prime Directive? I sometimes wonder.
That's right. It's once again, it's the optional directive. There's no real hard and fast rule about what qualifies and what doesn't. I mean, right off the bat, you have Kirk and Spock observing the villagers about to open fire, about to ambush the hill people off in some rocks in the little gully there. And Kirk just straight up goes ahead and pulls out his phaser. Like, he's going to shoot the villagers who have their muskets. And Spock's like, well, hang on a second, the Prime Directive. Don't you remember the thing that would get you kicked out of Starfleet, that would get you imprisoned? Because we're obviously before the Omega Glory, when the real stakes, the real punishment for violating the Prime Directive is emphasized. But so instead of shooting the villagers with his phaser, Kirk instead just picks up a rock and hurls it at the villagers. And I understand the idea of distracting them, but you're interfering in something that's going on between two Stone Age societies, and therefore you're intervening in a violation of the Prime Directive. So that was one of those things where it just turns out in a really murky way, like, why is he doing this? It's still, doesn't he understand what the Prime Directive is all about? It was a little bit confusing right at the start, and then it became, throughout the rest of the episode, entirely optional. I mean, it's optional from the start and just continued to be optional to the very end of this episode.
Yeah. And, because the Prime Directive, it is about interference, but that doesn't just mean one thing. It means interfering with the course of how a society is evolving, for example. And then you have Spock saying, no, you can't use your phaser. Kirk throws a rock instead, interferes. And then later you have Spock using a phaser to heat up some rocks, and is seen to have done this by Nona, which basically is another way of interfering. She now has access to information she shouldn't have. And then ultimately, yes, we have Kirk saying to Scotty, send down 100 flintlocks, which is, at that point, the Prime Directive is out the window entirely. It also begs the question: does he not have an admiral whose opinion he can ask for?
Maybe I should check in with Starfleet Command. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, Lieutenant Uhura, get Admiral so and so on the horn.
Yeah. What should I do here? I mean, there should be. That's a good point, because maybe there should be some consultation there, given the fact that the Klingons are intervening and have been intervening for some time and show no semblance of backing off of that. Once you get past the point where Kirk has interfered in a confrontation between the villagers and the hill people, the cat's out of the bag. The Prime Directive has been completely violated. So I guess maybe that's one of the reasons they just go all in at that point. Yeah, we're going to give you firearms here, and we'll help you out. Scotty's going to round up some muskets for you, and you can blow each other's brains out for all we care. We're gonna fly off somewhere else and have another adventure.
Yes, in for a penny, in for a pound. Because if I could get court-martialed and imprisoned for throwing a rock, I may as well give you advanced weaponry. Cool.
Right.
So,
Yeah, good point.
I wanted to ask you about the role the Mugato played. They were ranked the 43rd best alien of the Star Trek franchise by Den of Geek. 43rd doesn't sound like a very high on the list. Like, how many aliens are there? Is you probably know the answer to this question, but seriously, like, how
Right.
many aliens are there? So 43 doesn't sound like a very successful alien.
Yeah.
So, what was the role of the Mugato? And do you think they were the 43rd best aliens of Star Trek?
Good Lord, Mary. I was going to ask you the exact same question. So, if the villagers are the Viet Cong and the hill people are the South Vietnamese, the Enterprise is the Americans, the Klingons are the Soviets, what is the Mugato? How does that work into the allegory of this? Is it just a wild card, a fun thing for the kids? But I will say along those lines, when I first saw this episode when I was 7, 8 years old, I was terrified of the Mugato. I had
Hmm.
nightmares about that
Oh,
creature. And
really?
it wasn't necessarily how it looked, it was that shrieking noise that it
Yeah.
makes.
Yeah.
And so, and looking back as an adult, I'm trying to put all the puzzle pieces together as far as the allegory of it. And I can't make heads or tails of what that is. So, to answer your question, I don't know. I don't know what it's supposed to be as far as the allegory, at least, you know.
The only thing I could think, um, when I find them ridiculous, there's that. I mean, as an adult, I don't remember. I actually don't remember this episode as a child.
Hmm.
Um,
Wow.
Not sure why. Maybe because it was so traumatizing, I had to block it out. I don't know. But the only reason I could think for their existing is because on the one hand, it's more science fiction-y. It makes it because it's
Yeah.
not really a much of a science fiction episode,
Mhm.
really. It's about
Yeah.
two warring factions and two sides intervening, basically.
Mhm.
Um, and it also reveals some more information about Nona and empowers her in a way too. But I'm with you. What? Mugato? Why?
The science fiction-y thing is a great point because it adds a visible alien into the mix. So, yeah, I think that is probably the justification behind putting this creature in this episode because we're talking about just a bunch of guys wearing horrible wigs, by the way, especially the hill people. Those
Horrible.
blonde wigs are just crazy. They look like they just went into a Sears department store, grabbed a bunch of wigs off of the mannequins, slapped them on the heads of the actors, and they're
Yeah.
crooked in some cases. It's funny to me, but beyond that, yeah, I get it. We have to have an alien in this episode, and we'll make it this blood-curdlingly shrieking ape creature that still haunts my nightmares, Mary.
Oh no. Wow, this episode has a lot to answer for.
Yeah, yeah.
I know we want to get to your um how shall I put it? Your extremely and in some cases worrisomely detailed observations about
Mhm.
this episode, which we're going to be calling Bob's Geek Corner, I think.
Sure.
I don't know. Do we
Yep,
have does it
works.
have an official name yet? Yeah. I think we're gonna need a graphic for that. Um uh how does this episode how would you rank this episode in the original series and in the Star Trek franchise in general, personally?
It's not my favorite as a but as a political scientist, I appreciate the
Mm,
allegory, but as a story, I still have to quibble with not only the open-endedness of it, the lack of ability to take a firm stand on what we think about this war. And so in that regard, I feel like it fails a little bit. It's kind of stumbles at the end. And still, I don't know. I mean, you seem to interpret the serpent thing at the end to be that Kirk actually did have the weapons manufactured and delivered to the hill people. I found that to be a little bit more ambiguous.
mhm.
So, and in that regard, I feel as though while the story is successful. It's not Omega Glory by any stretch of the imagination. It still leaves a few things that should have been, I think, more firmly tied up in the episode. Although I will say, it has one of my favorite Kirk quotes in it. I even wrote this down. The quote is, "Our weapons grew faster than our wisdom, and we almost destroyed ourselves." So in addition to the obvious references to nuclear weapons there, I also think about the existence now, and obviously Roddenberry had no sense of this in 60 years ago, but now I think of the internet and social media, back to our conversation about Day of the Dove. And I wonder sometimes whether the internet, and this is one of my weird hangups, Mary, I think about this all the time. I wonder if the internet came along too soon in our evolution. Are we as people able to digest this tidal wave of information in our pockets every day around the clock? Whereas, 200 years ago, the worst thing, the most stressful thing that could happen into someone's life is a sick relative or one of the sheep runs away from the flock and you got to chase it down. Now we face thousands and thousands of problems in the world on our screens every day. Are we psychologically prepared for that as people? I don't know. Some days I don't believe that we were ready for this technology. So this is one of the things I think about when I hear that line from Kirk. Our weapons grew faster than our wisdom. I think that's one of the smartest lines I think that's ever been written in the context of a Star Trek episode.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and I do not believe we were ready. Well, let me put it this way: we were not ready for an unregulated internet. We at all. And whenever I think of the internet or the ways in which weapons have evolved, so to speak, I think just because you can do a thing doesn't mean you should do a thing. In fact, I think about that every time I see one of those massive mega yachts, those like Carnival cruise things that are 20 stories high, go down the Hudson River. That's what I think. Just because you can do a thing does not mean you should. And I you just put your finger on something that is another reason I have a problem with this episode. Humanity, Earth, has been through the post-apocalyptic horrors, and Star Trek was a direct result of the reckoning humanity did in the wake of those horrors. So you would think that somebody who says what Kirk says would be more thoughtful about introducing weapons into another primitive society. So that's yet another reason this episode doesn't land for me. I agree with you. It's not Omega Glory. Thank goodness very few things are. But
poor Omega Glory.
Omega Glory.
Yeah.
I know. But this episode for me doesn't even make the top. I don't even top 50.
Yeah, same. Yeah, I put it down there. Probably, maybe for me, around, as far as the original series go, maybe in the between 15 and 20, maybe 20 and 30, somewhere in that range. I know it's a wishy-washy answer, but yeah, I'm kind of there with you.
Oh no, I said 50, but that's
okay. Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. Well, you know what? Let's go with that. As far as the entire canon, I'll put it around 50. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And now it's time for Bob's Geek Corner. No, we need a better name than that. No, actually, I love this because I worry for your eyesight, but I love this. So, what did you observe about this episode that people like me probably didn't?
Well, this is once again, Mary, me standing too close to the view screen. I'm right up there, got my face pressed up against it, absorbing all of the electromagnetic radiation. First off, Strange New Worlds fans should definitely watch this episode. Not only do we get hints of a relationship between Nurse Chapel and Spock, but it's also the first episode to feature Booker Bradshaw as Dr. Mbenga, who treats Spock's terrible gunshot wound. Yes.
That's right.
Lots going on in this episode, including a whole drama playing out in sickbay with Nurse Chapel and Spock. Spock gets pretty beaten up there by Nurse Chapel. Scotty runs in, tries to intervene, not realizing that Spock wanted Chapel to start smacking him around to
Right.
revive him. So,
Yep.
but that was an interesting thing. I think the creators of Strange New Worlds had seen this episode and wanted to incorporate that kind of subtle relationship between Spock and Chapel. And then obviously Mbenga is one of the main players in Strange New Worlds.
That's right.
Next up, according to Memory Alpha, the original script called the monster, the Mugato, a Gumato with a G as the first letter. But
Okay.
DeForest Kelly kept saying it wrong. He kept saying Mugato instead of Gumato. So they changed it as the shooting went on. The credits will retain, the credits actually still retain the original name. So if you watch the credits, it still says Gumato.
Oh, DeForest.
Meantime, when Kirk is showing the hill people how to fire their muskets, they're doing some target practice in there. Mary, they're shooting toward their encampment where all of the other hill people are. So these characters who have no idea how to use a musket, they're being taught how to shoot for the very first time. They're shooting toward the other people in the little encampment there. It's a huge, I don't need to say it. It's a huge violation of gun safety. Never fire in the direction of a bunch of people. That's one of the first things they teach you about gun safety, at least from what I
Unless you're
understand.
Republican.
Yeah,
Sorry.
that's right. So I mentioned this early on, Mary. Judd Crucis is in fact not the name of the original writer of this episode. It was originally conceived by Don Ingalls, but he hated what Gene Roddenberry did with the rewrite, so he decided to use like an Alan Smithy type pseudonym for his credit, and he chose Judd Crucis as his screen name for this episode in protest of what Gene Roddenberry did to his concept.
I'm sensing a pattern. This is the second episode we've discussed in which the writer did not like what Roddenberry did with the story.
Yeah. And that is kind of an ongoing through line. We saw that occurring, I think, with the production of and the writing for the motion picture.
Yep.
Where there was lots of headbutting. And in fact, if you listen to Ron Moore and some others, in terms of the first couple of seasons of Next Generation, there was a lot of tension happening in the writer's room between Roddenberry and some of the writers getting fired and so on. So there was, I mean, this happens sometimes when you've got a creative genius like Gene Roddenberry having a very specific vision for something and then kind of culling people who don't pursue that vision the way he'd like it. So I think maybe that's part of the problem here.
I think that's probably true. It was his baby. Yeah.
And going back to the Mugato for a second, there's an episode of Lower Decks, which is the animated series on Paramount Plus. We learned that Mugato genitals were particularly sensitive to phaser fire. But my question about that is, isn't everyone's genitals sensitive to phaser fire? I mean, why?
Well, I don't know that I want to know the answer to that question.
You know, I don't know about you, Mary, but if I get shot in the genitals with a phaser, that's going to hurt. I'm just saying. Here's another instance where I don't know what's going on in my head. I think it's once again the radiation from the view screen, sitting too close. But I always thought the villager who consults with the Klingon, the villager with the mustache who's with the Klingon in the armory, they're talking about the different kinds of muskets and so forth. I always thought that villager looks exactly like author Kurt Vonnegut.
Oh.
It's just a thing that I noticed. Oh, that villager looks just like author Kurt Vonnegut. And I'll put, side by side up on the screen so you can see what I'm talking about, because it is kind of uncanny. The guy in this episode looks a whole lot like Kurt Vonnegut. I don't know if that was intentional.
Do we know that it for a fact that it is not Kurt Vonnegut?
It is not Kurt Vonnegut. Unfortunately, that would have been cool to have Kurt Vonnegut in this episode.
Really cool.
And finally, Mary, Ben Stiller, who is an avid Star Trek fan, named the Zoolander villain Jacobin Mugato, played by Will Ferrell, after the Mugato.
And he looks like him.
That's right. He kind of did. Didn't he have white hair?
Yeah, check this out. I say in this place
there
where
it
we're
is.
going to put a picture.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So that is it, Mary. I can step back away from the TV screen now.
Okay, we hope you enjoyed this conversation about a private little war. Next week, we are going to dive into another original series episode called A Taste of Armageddon, which I'm actually really looking forward to, Bob.
Oh, me too. This is, I think, appropriate to our times. There's a level of simulation going on here, and we'll definitely dive into the allegory of this very poignant episode of Star Trek, the original series.
All right, thanks for being with us today, and we will see you all next week.